Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. I'm not going to give you any prologues today. We are continuing with my reading of my notes, as I said before, about the 1001 Nights. So what happened last time, my last video, the last tale that I mentioned was the story of Taj al-Muluk Haran and Princess Dunya, which encompasses nights 107 to 137. And that story is within a larger story, which is that of King Uman ibn al-Numan and his family. A very long, the longest of the stories contained in volume 1. And now that I mentioned that, let me say this again, I am still using the Penguin edition in 3 volumes. So I hope with this video to finish talking about volume number 1. So we'll see if I can do that. So how does the story of King Uman ibn al-Numan and his family ends? I'm not going to tell you the ending, but what happens at the end of that story is that we find out what happens to the witch-like sorceress type of character of Dat al-Dawahi. So that is the end of that story and of that character, very important character of this first part of the book. So moving on a little bit, we have on nights 146 and 147, we start seeing some animal stories. So basically, in other words, some fables, okay? I thought these were very interesting. They are quite moralistic, actually. And the first one that I wrote about here is the story of the peahen, the duck, and the gazelle, okay? Now, within that story, the duck, one of the characters, tells the story of the lion cub, okay? And the story of the lion cub is about this little lion who keeps hearing about how terrible and how ferocious the sons of Adam, human beings, are. And when he finally meets a human being, he meets him in the form of an old carpenter. So what he thinks is like, this is the, such a menacing thing, such a menacing animal, quote unquote. He is misled by appearances. In this case, that is one of the morals of this story. Just because the man looks frail, it doesn't mean that he is not intelligent and he's still smart. So you can find out what happens to the lion cub for underestimating basically the intelligence of human beings in this case. And then in this story, the frame story of the peahen, the gazelle, and the duck, we have basically the difference between these animals is that some of them glorify God and others do not. And so the ones who glorify God meet a good end, and the ones who do not meet, a not very positive end here. So those are some of the interesting stories that I found. And then one of my favorites, it's a very, very short story that you can find on night 150. Okay, so on night 150 we have within a larger story, the story of the man and the snake, right? And this is such a short story that I was wondering if I could just tell you the story, because I thought it was very good and very nice. So if you don't want to hear the story, I guess you can skip ahead. That is a good thing about YouTube. So in this story we have a snake who is trying to run away from the snake charmer. So she meets a man, and the snake says, can you please help me here? I really want to escape from this guy. I don't want to work for him anymore. So if you could give me a hand and just help me to escape from here, you would not regret it, because I will give you a great reward. So what happens is the man says, okay, I'm going to get a reward here. So I will help this snake to escape from the snake charmer. He takes the snake and places it in his breast pocket. So he walks away, nobody notices, and the snake is able to escape from the snake charmer. So at that point the man says, okay, so where's my reward? What was that great reward that you were going to give me? And the snake asks him, where do you want me to bite you? Because that is all that we snakes know how to do. So very, very simple story, but isn't that great? There's a great a great moral there. The snake, that's all they know how to do. It's basically talking about, sometimes people just do what they know how to do, and that is the point here. I was reminded of another different story with this, And also, I was thinking as I read the story of something that Francis Bacon says in one of his essays. He says something to the effect that I'm going to look it up and I'll place it here or somewhere so that you can find the source. But he says, that sometimes some people are like, like a rose plant that has thorns. It's like, they will prick you, the thorns, but it's because they just don't know any better. That's all they know how to do. So you cannot, blame them in some cases. And a very famous story, very similar to this one, is the fable, I guess I would call it, because it involves animals, of the frog and the scorpion. You may have heard this one. It's included. You can find it in the movie, the great movie by Neil Jordan, The Crying Game. One of the characters tells this story there in that movie, and it's also, believe it or not, in an episode of MacGyver. Okay, I'll tell you the story once again. If you don't want to hear the story, you can always skip. But what happens in this other story, not included in the 1001 Nights, is that a frog arrives at the edge of a pond. Okay, he wants to cross to the other side, and right there at the edge of the pond he meets a scorpion, and the scorpion turns to the frog and says, "Wow, this is really good. I really need to get to the other side of this pond, so I would really appreciate it if you would help me." The scorpion says, "I can climb on your back, right? And that way you can just swim, as you know how to do, and we will both get to the other side of the pond." The frog, of course, says, "Yeah, right, the moment that you climb on my back, you're going to sting me or something, and I'm going to die because of the poison." Now the scorpion says, very logically, he tells the frog, he says, "Look, that would not make any sense, because if we are crossing the river and I sting you, I don't know how to swim. So you're going to die because of the poison, and I'm going to drown. So what's the point in that? That would be very stupid of me." The frog is convinced. He says, "Wow, that makes sense. That is very logical." So he decides to help the scorpion cross this pond to the other side. When they're in the middle of the pond, the scorpion stings the frog. Okay, so it happens. And as they are both dying, the frog because of the poison and the scorpion because of drowning, basically, the frog says, "What the heck, you told me you were not going to do that. What's the point here? Now we're both dying." And the scorpion, of course, says, "I can't help it. It's my nature." Right? That is the end of the story. And it's the same idea, if you see what I mean, about the story with the snake and the man who helps her to escape from the snake charmer. Great stories, if you ask me. I mean, I love stories like that. There's such important lessons to be learned there, and both of them are very, very short and very simple. Moving on, on night 153, we have the story of Ali ibn Bakr and Shams al-Nahar. This is a tale of two lovers who cannot bear to be apart. There are many, many stories in the 1001 Nights about the consuming, even sometimes the destructive nature of love, or at least of one perception of love, right? You can ask the question that great philosopher David Coverdale of Whitesnake asked, "Is this love?" Right? That's something that we can explore. But the idea is there that these people, they have a perception of love that is quite destructive. I jumped to night 170, where we have the story of King Shahriman and his son Kamar al-Zaman. This is a very long but very good story. It covers nights 170 to 249, and that is 140 pages in my Penguin edition of the 1001 Nights. And this is the story of a king who wanted his son to get married, but the son is not really interested in women at all. He does not trust them. Remember how the 1001 Nights begins with adultery, right? So once again, we do not have a very progressive view of women, I'm afraid, here, at least on the surface. Okay, that is the surface. It's much more complex than that, and we always have to remember that at the center of the 1001 Nights, we have the empowered, resourceful figure of Shahrazad, of course, right? The storyteller, the keeper of stories and morals and all those things. So Kamar al-Zaman refuses to get married, right? And what King Shahriman does is to lock him up in a tower because he's being disobedient. And it just so happens that in that tower, the Jinniya Maimuna lives. she sees Kamar and she is just struck by this prince's beauty, right? Later on, she meets the Ifrit Danash, who says that he has seen a beautiful girl, the Princess Budur, and they both quarrel as to who is the more beautiful, Kamar or Budur. So what they decide to do is they decide to bring an Ifrit who's going to serve as judge, so that they can establish, which one of these two is the more beautiful here. They put the two lovers together asleep so that one of them sees the other lover sleeping, right? And they're going to see that way which one of them is more captivated by the other's beauty. Well, it turns out that Budur has more difficulty in controlling herself when she sees Kamar, and so it is concluded that Kamar is more beautiful. Now, there's a reason why Kamar controls himself, but I don't want to spoil the story for you. But there's an ironic comment there on attraction and the way these two act when they see each other. So the lovers then are separated, right? Princess Budur is taken to her place once again, and when Kamar wakes up, he is still, of course, struck by her beauty. He cannot forget her, and he assumes that Budur is the woman that his father wanted him to marry. So all of a sudden he changes his mind, right? After seeing her. But you can imagine his disappointment when he wakes up and he realizes that Budur is nowhere to be found. So that story continues, right? I'm seeing here what I can tell you so as not to, reveal or to spoil the whole story for you. Eventually, the two characters, Kamar and Budur, follow different paths. Very interesting ones, because Kamar, for instance, finds a garden with a secret trapdoor that leads to a chamber full of treasure. So he has his fate right there for him. And Budur, for her part, ends up very interestingly dressed in Kamar's clothes, and through an interesting turn of events, she finds herself in a different kingdom, taken for a man because she's wearing Kamar's clothes, given possession of the kingdom, and married to the king's daughter. Nobody knows that she's a woman. So we have a very interesting story right there. And actually the end of this story of Kamar and Budur is, I believe, the last scene that you can find in Pasolini's film. So that little ironic scene at the end is really the story of Kamar and Budur. I believe Pasolini gave this story to different characters, maybe to give his movie a little bit more unity, because the movie is much shorter than the book, of course. So the story of Kamar and Budur, I would say, was one of my favorites, and it continues. It is related to the following story that we find in the 1001 Nights. There are marriages, the usual thing. Then we have the story of Al-Amjad and Al-Asad. And these are connected to their stepmothers, okay? Once again, I'm trying to see what I can tell you so as not to reveal. But we have a very, scandalous story right here in which stepmothers develop feelings for each other's sons. Okay, I was reminded of a novella that I read a while ago for my video on novellas written by women, The Grandmothers, by Doris Lessing, which was made into a movie titled Adore. So a very modern, I guess you would say, story right here of the entanglements of love and attraction. So we have these two stepbrothers and their fate, connected to their mothers, stepmothers, and their feelings for them. And embedded within this story of Al-Amjad and Al-Asad, we have the story of Nima and Num, which is another tale of lovers who are driven mad by separation. There's another story about that too. On nights 249 to 270, we have the story of Ala al-Din, another story of parted lovers and adventures, that they have adventures separately. So you have these two fates, right? Then on nights 276 to 279, I found very interesting the story of Iram, the city of columns. And one of the reasons why I like this story is because I found some parallels, some similarities to the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. So if you're interested in that kind of story, a story in which pride comes before the fall, as the saying goes, right? That's a story that you may want to check out. Then nights 279 to 282 include the story of Ishaq ibn al-Mawsili, which has a very, very good premise, okay? Because in this story we have a man who sits on a basket, right? He finds a basket, which is an elevator, actually. He sits on that basket and the basket goes up and it takes him to a room where he enjoys the company of a beautiful woman and the complications that arise after that. So every night he goes there and he is, elevated to this chamber of pleasure, if you will. One of my favorite stories of this volume number one I found on nights 282 to 285, and that is the story of the slaughterhouse cleaner and the lady. This is a very funny story, a very ironic story. It's a story that has a punchline, so I really appreciate that. It's almost a joke that you can tell. And this story begins with a man who is heard praying at the Kaaba that a woman may quarrel with her husband so that he, the man, may sleep with her. Imagine that. When people hear him say that, that's awful, right? How are you going to pray for that? And then he tells his story, right? How it was that he ended up in that situation and praying for that. And you have to keep this in mind. This is a guy who works at a slaughterhouse. Okay, he's a slaughterhouse cleaner who finds the opportunity to be with a lady, a very distinguished lady. And at the end of that story, you find that hilarious punchline that I was telling you about. So check out that one. Nights 282, once again, to 285. So that is really, really a very nice way to get to the ending of this first volume of the 1001 Nights. Now, as I told you before in my previous video on the 1001 Nights, the Penguin edition includes at the end of volume number one the story of Ali Baba and the 40 thieves killed by a slave girl. That is the complete title of this story. And as you may know, as I told you before also, this is a story that was not found in the original text of the 1001 Nights. It's an addition that was made by Galland, the French translator of this huge monumental work, but it has become one of the most famous, right? You can say the same thing of the story of Aladdin. And what I wrote here about that, I said this is a magnificent story, one of the collection's most famous. It was added by French translator Antoine Galland, who heard it from the Syrian storyteller Hanna Diab. It has an excellent premise, okay, and a fantastic setting, so you really have to love that. Great memorable characters, including a strong female character at the center of the story. Okay, we have to really emphasize that second part of the title here, the story of Ali Baba and the 40 thieves killed by a slave girl. That is very, very important here. It's, in a sense, I almost thought it's not really the story of Ali Baba, but the story of the slave girl. She should be given more importance here. And as always, you may have purists who believe that this story should not be included because it was not part of the original collection. But I personally, I'm really thankful to Galland for including it here, because I think it's a really, really good addition. And this is a book that is alive, as I said before. You can add whatever you want to it, as De Quincey did, as Stevenson did, as Edgar Allan Poe did, and as Galland did also. So it's a great story about female resourcefulness, and it's a girl, a slave girl nonetheless, who saves the day. So those are the notes that I have for volume number one of the 1001 Nights. I hope you found something here in this video that is useful to you, and as always, I hope that my comments inspire you to read the original text and to have that experience for yourself. Any comments, questions, recommendations? I am always happy to hear those. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.